Before we begin, I would like to take a minute or two to tell you a little bit about the League of Women Voters. The League is a nonpartisan organization that's been around for almost 100 years. We celebrate our 100th anniversary on Valentine's Day next year, 2020. It was founded 6 months before the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution that gave women the right to vote. And just as a little aside, Wisconsin was the very first state to ratify the 19th Amendment. We can be proud of that. Our local league was founded in 1961. The purpose of the league when it was founded was to provide support for women's suffrage. Over time, its role has changed to become a grassroots action organization open to women and men since 1973 to promote active participation in government through education and advocacy. We have membership materials. If somebody would like to join the League of Women Voters, they can be found on the table over there. And you can ask any of the league members if you have questions or need assistance. Tonight our forum topic is socialism, and our speaker is Dr. Robert Walensky. He's Professor Emeritus of Sociology and Social Work at UWSP. He's been a professor for 43 years. He has a particular interest in history and has done extensive research on political and economic topics to better understand past and contemporary society. He's the author of 7 books and numerous articles. He will speak for about 40 minutes and we'll have time for questions afterwards. Please welcome Dr. Walensky.
So I just put this on, do you think?
You can.
Something like this.
Yeah. See if that's
There we go. I'll use this just so we can be sure everyone can hear me. There's a microphone here too, but this is very much for the recording. Many thanks to the League for sponsoring this and many other events that help promote civil society. They record all these events, and I'm sure there's a wonderful archive someplace in Stevens Point where these, I hope, are used for further education in schools, clubs, and elsewhere. I'd like to thank you all for coming on such a lovely evening, one of these beautiful fall evenings in Wisconsin. We have an important topic, I think, which I gathered took priority over such an important evening outside. The topic is, of course, socialism, a code word if there ever was one. And my premise tonight is simply that we don't know what it means. So I'm asking, what is it anyway? And the second part of what I'll say would be related to the fact that it really should not be an issue in this campaign. And I hope to make that argument clear. To begin this quest for what is on what is socialism, we have to understand the big misunderstood four. We don't know what capitalism, what socialism, what communism and democracy, we don't really know what these things are. We throw them around, we hear them on the news, we read about them, but what specifically are they? So, let's begin with capitalism. What is capitalism? This is our economic system, right? It is an economic system first and foremost. It's not a political system, it's an economic system where private individuals or stockholders own productive facilities and resources. Most companies are privately owned, as a matter of fact. Some of these small shops along here are owned by one person, or maybe 2 people. But the bigger ones are stock ownership, right? Stock ownership. But it's private ownership. All corporations must be chartered by the government, but they're privately owned, and they're privately run, and the decision making is done privately. Market forces influence capitalism, especially you know about supply and demand. It's always quite a miracle that the gallons of milk going into Milwaukee every day equals the gallons of milk consumed in Milwaukee and Stevens Point and Warsaw. Very little waste, because there's a market mechanism, there's a pricing system. If you charge $20 for a gallon of milk, you're going to have a lot left over. It's going to be wasted. If you charge $1, well, people are going to be unhappy because they can't get the milk. So it's set at a place which feeds back to the producers and the distributors, and it's called the hidden hand of capitalism, a term coined by Adam Smith, kind of the intellectual founder of capitalism, who wrote a very important book in an easy year to remember, 1776. He wrote The Wealth of Nations. The previous economic system, mercantilism, was run by the monarchy, was run by whoever was king or queen. If you wanted to trade tea to India in 1700, you had to get a special charter permission form from the King of England. You couldn't just go trade, get a clipper ship and go and buy. No, you had to have a license. And the king controlled the entire economy this way. And the king got a kickback from that license called a royalty. And we still use that term. The idea was that you improve the wealth of the nation by pouring money into the top. The king makes a lot of money, the merchants make money, and the money, and then it trickles down because the king needs a new castle and the merchants need a new ship, etc. So it was a very top-oriented system controlled by the king and his ministers, or the queen. Adam Smith said this is the wrong idea. We should give each individual a chance to be an entrepreneur and pursue their own interests, and then the wealth will bubble up. They'll create demand at the bottom. And it was a completely radical idea. And believe it or not, Adam Smith and his followers were called liberals. You hear of neoliberalism today? Well, that's kind of the idea, that the 18th, 19th century pure capitalism with very little government regulation, because the king's the enemy. And his ministers and all his taxes and royalties. We want freedom from government. We want laissez-faire, the French called it. Let them do what they want. If we all pursue our own interests, everything will be fine. Even the public interest will be taken care of, is the idea. The theory. There's individualistic capitalism, which is what the US really has. I mentioned Smith, little government regulation. Government's job is to prevent monopoly, support competition, build the national defense, build the roads and sewers, infrastructure, otherwise facilitate private enterprise. Social capitalism is not opposed to all these, of course, preventing monopoly, which was Adam Smith's #1 goal. Because if you let capitalists alone, said Smith, they'll eat each other up, the big fish will swallow the small fish, you'll have monopoly, which is the antithesis of capitalism. So Smith did not trust businessmen. The last thing they really want is competition. And capitalism is based on competition. Support competition, prevent monopoly. Well, another form evolved, mainly in Europe, and Canada, and other places, where there's many government regulations on behalf of the common good. Since World War II, especially in Europe, we had a lot of this, and basically had this between 1934 and about the 1980s. A lot of regulations in the public interest. Some of them, too many regulations. But the idea was to, prevent another Great Depression. So we regulated Wall Street to beat the band. We had very high taxes to spread it around. And we still do have some of this, of course. I'll talk more about that. It began with Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. This social capitalism where we still want a stock market, we still want profits, we still want companies, right? We're not opposed to this. But if you let capitalism really alone, it not only creates monopoly, but it creates gross inequalities. Gross inequalities. It's not an opinion, it's a well-established fact. The 19th century was an example of this, and we're going back to it today, unfortunately, gross inequality. Other aspects of capitalism, private property, absolutely essential, because in 1700, who owned all the property? The nobility. The nobility owned, you go to England, go to France, the nobility owned almost all the property. And so the individual couldn't get any property. Stock markets, you know, stock markets, corporate law, currency, interest rates, regulations. The governments in the modern economy always set the interest rates. Interest rates used to float with the supply and demand. No more. It creates constant recessions and depressions. So the Federal Reserve, which is a federal agency, sets the interest rates. It tries to keep inflation low and keep demand high. That's really that's a 20th century invention. And the Federal Reserve is the key. And since the 30s, there's been all kind of government bailouts when businesses fail and stock markets crash. Because, ladies and gentlemen, one of the other problems of capitalism is that the market fails all the time. Capitalism fails all the time. Not only these big crashes like we had 10 years ago, had in the 30s. In the 19th century, there was a Great Depression about every 30 years. Until we kind of figured out how to even that out with the Federal Reserve and with government spending, thanks to an economist named John Maynard Keynes in the 30s. But the irony here is that capitalism couldn't exist without government regulation. Any capitalism, social or individual, interest rates, bailouts, tax laws, interstate commerce, trade, safety, defense. We know that our fleets are keeping the sea lanes open for oil, right? I mean, that's one of the main jobs of the U.S. Navy. Right? Because oil is the lifeblood of the modern capitalist economic system. But as I mentioned, it invariably leads to inequalities in wealth and in power. 19th century, monopoly, oligopoly. We passed the Sherman Antitrust in 1890. A trust is a monopoly to break up big oil companies like Rockefeller Oil. Rockefeller had 90% of the oil. So you had to break it up. And those companies are still around, Exxon Mobil, although they merged. But Ohio and Boron, the Standard of California, Esso, these were all one big company. But we broke them up. Clayton again in 1914 to break them up. The New Deal of the 30s and 40s did a lot to equalize the society, because we should not forget, ladies and gentlemen, that we had no middle class in the United States. Really, no sizable middle class as we know it and as we are members of, until after World War II. If you go back to the 20s and the 30s, there was the wealthy class and there was basically the working class. It was very wide and very broad, including farmers, semi-skilled people, skilled people. The middle class as we know it is a result in a large part of the post-war boom, but New Deal programs such as the right to unionize. Because unions bargain for good contracts that bring middle-class wages and middle-class benefits, and even if a firm is not unionized, it has to keep its eye on what the unions are paying. And as unions have gone down and down and down over the past 30 years, wages have gone down and down and down and down. I don't think it's an unexpected relationship, a surprise relationship. But the middle class is very new in world history. I mean, in world history, we are probably the first group raised in mass in the middle class. So we're quite historic, we people sitting here in this audience. There was a middle class, don't get me wrong, in 1700, but it was extremely small. It was mostly peasants in 1700. By the way, what was the old deal before 1930, the 30s and the 40s and the 50s? The old deal was that you worked maybe 10, 12 hours a day. You got very little in wages. You had no benefits, no union. You had no vacation. You had no retirement system. No retirement system. And the huge profits that were generated, and it was tremendous in this country, despite starts and stops, went to the stockholders and the owners. That's the old deal. And it also included child labor. Let me not forget to add. A lot of child labor. Well, the New Deal did away with virtually all this, including child labor, and it institutes the 8-hour day in 1930s. Social Security in 1930s, the right to unionize in 1930s. We did get workmen's compensation much earlier. And by the way, Wisconsin was the first state to pass the workmen's compensation law in 1911. If you're hurt on the job, you get a pension, which companies have to contribute to. We were very progressive along a lot of lines, including women's suffrage. And the first state to allow public employees to unionize too. Those were the days. So the old deal was the old deal, but the new deal was that everybody's going to get a cut of this wonderfully productive, and let me emphasize that, capitalist system. Wonderfully productive. No system can generate as much wealth and as much income and as much opportunity as a capitalist system. History has proven that. But there is the social question, which bugged people, philosophers, politicians, sociologists, political scientists, throughout the 19th century. What about the inequalities? What about those left behind? What about the slums that Dickens is writing about? Because don't forget, Dickens is writing about the Industrial Revolution, which began in England about 1750 or so, right around when Smith's writing, and other people are writing, and this is the Industrial Revolution is the capitalist revolution. Because who's paying for all these new industries? All railroads and factories and cotton mills, and then it comes over here, and then it goes to Germany, and it goes to Europe. And right now, by the way, it's going to, well, it's already gone to China and the Far East and other parts of the world. In fact, we are right now living in another capitalist revolution, global capitalist revolution, with some potentially, not potentially, with some real dire consequences for the environment. Come back to that. All right, that's capitalism. What is socialism? Well, socialism is also an economic system. Its birth is a little later than capitalism, as we know it. It's 19th century. But it involves public or government ownership of productive facilities, and not private ownership, but public, state ownership, government. Government, furthermore, plans the economy. In a pure socialist system, we're going to make as much milk as we think we ought to make to go into Milwaukee, and if there's not enough, tough. Because there's no market feedback mechanism. We don't have a pricing system. No hidden hand. We're going to make so many size 10 shoes, and when we're out of 10s, that's it. If you have small feet, you put cotton in the toe. If you have big feet, you got to make those shoes last a little longer till next year. But the government's doing this in the public interest because there's not going to be any rapacious capitalist companies skimming off all this wealth and creating great inequality. Well, that's big capitalism. That's theoretical socialism, theoretical socialism. We have a lot of small-scale socialism, which it doesn't involve the federal government necessarily owning everything, although the federal government does really own Amtrak, the national railway system. It's a private government corporation is what it is. But if you want rail service, The government's got to run it because the market will not do it. Markets fail all the time. Not enough profits in rail. Anywhere in the world. They're all government owned. Now, England has privatized parts of its rail system, but the government maintains the tracks, which are very expensive. And one branch, which was privatized in England, was so badly run, the government just retook it over. The south branch down in south of London. Constant delays. But UWSP is state-owned, the US Post Office, by the way, which England just privatized, sold it off as a for-profit company now. Stevens Point Fire Department, we used to have private fire departments in the United States. Every year you had to pay a fee to belong to a fire department and put a sticker in your window, and when your house caught on fire, they'd say, okay, you're one of ours, and we'll put it out. But if you were in a neighborhood where it was a long ways away, and you know, the closest fire department to you didn't belong to because you didn't like those people, your house would burn till your guys got there. Yeah. So we decided to do away with private fire departments. We have now public fire departments. We have public police, and we have the Veterans Administration hospitals, which, by the way, are government-owned. A great example of socialized medicine. We'll come more to that. The U.S. Defense Department, huge operation. And let us not forget the Wisconsin Rapids Waterworks and Lighting Commission. Anybody here from the Rapids? Well, their water and light in Rapids is a socialist enterprise owned by the local government. You pay your bill to the government, local government in Rapids. Okay? So these are small-scale examples of government ownership. Is democracy prevailing? I mean, I think we still have democracy anyway. Here's a good example, the Great Lakes Utilities operation. A consortium of municipal-owned utilities from Clintonville, Kiel, Manitowoc, these other places, Marshfield's in there. They've come together at wholesale power markets to assist the supply of power. So it's like a conglomerate, a socialist conglomerate of agencies who have pulled together to make sure that they all have sufficient power. It's private, it's nonprofit, it's government run. The real problem is the confusion of socialism with communism. An understandable confusion, a very understandable, because we don't know a lot about this, and we're ignorant. We're not stupid, we're just ignorant about this. But some politicians have bumped the drum for obvious reasons. It has been purposeful in some cases. It's been a political football in some cases, because when you mention the word socialism, it's a shorthand for government involvement or government regulation, and we don't like that. That's been an ideology that's been very strong for the past half century. Government's the enemy. Shows no knowledge of small-scale socialism, as I've just talked about, where government owns smaller operations, like the post office, which is not that small, actually. Another confusion is between socialism and the welfare state. People say, oh, Sweden is a huge socialist country. No, it's not. 98% of the businesses in Sweden are owned by private companies. There's a big stock market in Sweden. But what Sweden has is a very big welfare state. So you live there and know about Scandinavian countries. Very big welfare states. Government policies and programs designed to address individual needs and social needs unmet by the market. Nowhere in the world does the market give everyone health care. It's just too difficult. It's just too difficult. The modern welfare state began in Germany in the 1880s with pensions and health care, retirement benefits begun under Otto von Bismarck in the 1880s, and it expanded in Germany. Germany's always been a leader in this. The UK had old age pensions, the national health system. At those dates, the National Health Service, more about that later. We were a real latecomer. We didn't get Social Security until 1935, and it was in the Great Depression. It's part of the New Deal. Get Medicare in 65, Medicaid in 65, and the American, and Obamacare in 2010. And we still don't cover maybe 30 million Americans that don't have health insurance. And I'm not talking about being illegal, I'm talking about citizens. We're a latecomer, and we have one of the weakest welfare states, if not the weakest of any of the first world rich capitalist democratic countries. But we think we have the biggest welfare state. Why we think we have the biggest welfare state is another question. The welfare state, part 2, we expanded to include education, housing, food programs, transportation subsidies, and so forth. It's needed because, again, the market fails all the time. The market will not house the poor. Not house the poor, at least in sufficient numbers. Education is a public good that business cannot address. 90% of the US students go to public schools. We know the great crisis of for-profit higher education institutions, right? They have been a very spotty record. A very spotty record. Many have gone bankrupt for profit. So you know how it works? People give you, a piece of paper called a stock, and you give them $100, let's say, for the piece of stock, for the share of stock, and you want profits. You want returns on that. And that, it works well in many cases, say making automobiles, okay? But it doesn't work in all cases, like housing the poor, or the Tennessee Valley Authority in the 1930s. Electricity for poor areas of the South. Here's how it would have to work. Say a power company in the South would say, listen, I want to sell you stock in the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the Tennessee Power Company, let's call it. And there's $100 a share, and here's some stock, you give me $100, and I'll give you returns, but it's going to take, maybe 10 or 15 years before there's any profits. By the time we build these dams and these electrical facilities, or the Hoover Dam, only government can do that because the market's not patient. We want returns on our investment this quarter. I don't even care about next quarter. I want returns right now. You want me to wait 10 years to get a return on my dollar? A man on the moon was the same thing. Although there are now private companies doing that, but they're relying tremendously on government R&D to put that stuff up there. But the private sector is now moving into the space shots. But only government could have done that. Because the investors would never wait to put a man on the moon, 10 years or whatever it took us, 9 years. Okay. So markets fail all the time. That's why you need the welfare state. Now, welfare state capitalism, okay? It's not socialism. Social Security is an example of the welfare state, but that's not really socialism, although it's talked about as being so, on TV all the time. It's a public program designed to meet the needs that the market really can't meet. Now you say, well, the market could meet our retirement needs. No, it can't. For one thing, you may recall 10 years ago when there was a Great Recession. If we didn't have Social Security, if you were all in the stock market, and if you retired right at 10 years ago, you'd have lost your retirement savings. It took a long time for the market to come back, and markets usually do come back, at least so far. But Social Security is always there. It's always there. It's a separate fund. It's still in surplus, by the way. It's still in surplus. It's going to be in surplus for another 10 years and what? It's its own fund, although the government's been borrowing from that fund, but that's another story. Okay? So it's a public program that it's needed. And to address needs that stockholders want returns now, and the market is not patient in housing the poor, okay? But, you know, a welfare state doesn't take away capitalism. In fact, it can even help the market by providing for a healthier and more secure workforce. This is what the Europeans think. The Europeans have health, education, and welfare unbelievable. And they have a happier and a healthier workforce. That's their argument, with much less poverty in those societies. And poverty has instituted great social costs. Crime, for example. Who has more crime than the United States? We have more folks behind bars than any country. And I don't mean even as a percent of population. I mean in total numbers, we have the most prisoners. Even places like China and India, which are much bigger than us, they have far fewer prisoners than we do. And many of theirs are political. Many of ours are economic prisoners. Number one crime here? Theft related, economic related. And it helps communities and societies safer. Now, socialized medicine. Boy, is this I've been obfuscated. The government owns and operates facilities, as we've said. The only socialized medicine in this country is the VA, the Veterans Administration. All those employees are government employees in the VA. That's true in the UK, National Health Service, and it's true in Scandinavia. They're all government employees. Now, true, there's some private care in the UK and there's some private care in Scandinavia. You can buy some private care. It's very expensive. It's only used by a few percent of the population. There's few for-profit hospitals, moreover, in the West, including the US. Most of our hospitals are private non-profit, like St. Michael's or the Marshfield Clinic area, St. Joseph's. They're private. They're between for-profit and socialist government. They're private non-profit. All right? Most of our hospitals are private non-profit. All the hospitals in England to speak of are government-owned, but there's even wings which are private sometimes. Yeah. So there's some of that over there. And the Tories, the Conservatives, have been trying to privatize, and they've been defunding, they've been cutting funds for the national health system for a long time. So England is hurting right now with healthcare. I mean, so many austerity cuts in England, it's just hurting everything. The UK is socialized medicine. As I say, Canada is not socialized medicine, but it's a single payer. All those hospitals in Canada are private non-profit, except for the veterans ones. Germany has, listen to this one, all facilities must be private non-profit, clinics, hospitals, and everyone must be covered by a non-profit insurance company. That's right. That's the German law. And the insurance companies are in competition with each other for customers, so they have to watch price and everything else. Now the doctors are paid very high in this system, so they're not that happy in Germany, many doctors. But it's a non-profit system. It's not socialized medicine, it's not capitalist medicine, like Humana would be. France is socialized medicine. Japan's like Germany, Switzerland's like Germany. I gather in China, we have a Chinese citizen here. David, is the Chinese system, is it more like England's? Is it socialized medicine, I would think, in China?
Well, it's now in the transition.
The transition?
Private.
You have more private?
For profit, something like that.
Mixed.
Yeah.
Mostly state-owned?
Mostly state-owned.
I would say in China, mostly state-owned. Because most economies are mixed. Here's the other thing about socialism. You know, it's really not that prevalent. Full-blown socialism. Now, there's some small socialism, like I mentioned, but mixed economies. I've already mentioned examples of public ownership here. Don't forget that 10 years ago, you and I owned General Motors and Chrysler, right? To save GM and Chrysler, we bought all the stock. Every stock we bought. Who bought it? Well, the federal treasury did. The taxpayers did. The government's main source of income is tax. 90-some% of the federal government's income is our taxes. So we bought it to save it, And Renault is owned by the French government in part, automobile company. Volkswagen is owned by state government in part. And Airbus, which is a major competitor of Boeing, is owned by the governments of France, Germany, and Spain, as well as private individual stockholders. You can buy stock in Airbus. But the government's own controlling interest. Because that's how the Europeans do things. Over here, it's like, a mouse in the room. You hear the word socialist, oh my God, it must be communist. No, it's not. As far as I know, France and Germany and Spain are still democracies. UK had really established its socialism after World War II. British Telecom was owned by the government. British Overseas Air Corporations, the railroads, British Motors, Jaguar and MG and all those were government owned. The coal mines were owned, the steel company was owned, and let us not forget the BBC. All government owned. Then, when Margaret Thatcher came in, she sold off all these. Sold them off. They're now private companies. They're not traded on their stock market. Why did she sell them off? Because they were being run very inefficiently. Why were they being run very inefficiently? Because the government only took them over in the first place after the private sector ran them into the ground. Like General Motors and Chrysler 10 years ago. But in England, the problem was that the investors sent their money over here to invest in our companies throughout the 20th century, and capitalists starved their businesses. They did not have the money for new investments in new technologies, new mousetraps. So the British companies fell way behind because no one can control where you're going to invest your money in a private sector thing, right? So the government took them over, when the government took them over in 1948, they were already behind, way behind. And they couldn't keep up. So Maggie Thatcher privatized them, and they've since made a bit of a comeback because the profit motive does do good things in many cases. We revived these companies. I know when I was there in '91, we could have bought stock in British Telecom. Probably should have. Up to 1/3 of the economy was owned by the government in 1948, in 1980 in the UK. About 1/3 of the economy. But 2/3 was still privately owned. A mixed economy. And a democracy. Always a democracy. Right? Always a democracy. The Church of England still existed. The US has 33 federally chartered agencies, which is what you might call small-scale socialism. They're chartered by the government. I mentioned the TVA, right? I mentioned the post office. That takes care of our pensions. You may have heard of some of these, like the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. They're chartered. They're not technically owned, but they're chartered by the federal government. The federal government watches over them. They have their own board of directors and their own charters and their own bylaws and their own officers. So it's kind of a middle way. State-owned enterprises, socialism, right? Let's take China. Communist country? Yes. Socialist country? Hardly. Here's the numbers. Okay. Here's the 60, 70, 80, 90. 60% of China's GDP, the size of the economy, is private sector. 70% of the innovation, 80% of the urban employment, and 90% of the new jobs are government directed from this source anyway. So China is moving to this strange, interesting mixed economy, and the world's largest stock market, Shanghai's 4th, Hong Kong 5th, Shenzhen is 8th. The world's largest stock market, New York. New York Stock Exchange. The world's second largest stock market, New York. The tech market. A few other confusing concepts to move right along. Secularism. It's been tied to socialism. Not necessarily. Irreligion, atheism, godlessness? Not necessarily. Communism, yes. Yes. Communism is not tolerant of religion. Pure theoretical communism. The Catholic Church resisted socialism big time between 1890 and 1960. You want to know why there's no socialism in America? One reason may be because the unions, who often brought it to Europe, at least part socialism, in this country, Catholics had great influence in our unions. And the Catholic Church worked vigorously to keep socialism out of American unions. Some good stuff written about this. Because it was thought to be the next step to communism, but not necessarily. Fundamentalist Catholics still make this linkage. In fact, fundamentalists and evangelicals still make the linkage, okay, between socialism and godlessness, or socialism and secularism and godlessness. Not necessarily. England is the example. The Church of England did just fine when the economy was third owned by government. And government and religion's even coming back in China. Churches have been opening in China. Overblown fears about socialism. It's a code word for communism, as I say, based on ignorance and outright deception of political football. Healthcare gets in there, socialized medicine. An unfounded fear that government programs will destroy democracy. I think if you look at the 1930s, the government programs saved democracy, including programs to save businesses. If it wasn't for the New Deal, who knows what would have happened. There were plans to take over the government. There were coup attempts in the works. Finally, what is communism? Well, not finally. Next, what is communism? It's a governmental system, not an economic system. The Communist Party controls the government and rules as the only viable party. I know China does have 12 parties, I believe it is. 12 parties. China likes to think it's multi-party, but only one party really rules. Sorry, David, it's my opinion. It plans all aspects of the society, including the economy, because pure communism does imply socialism. Economic system, political system. All right? The government plans everything. No dissent, no free press, or impartial courts. All communist countries have socialist economies. USSR, old China, Cuba, to this day, comes to mind. Vietnam comes to mind. But not all socialist or partly socialist economies have communism. We've talked about these examples. These are democracies. Now they're flawed democracies, but they're still democracies. And keep in mind, parenthetically, that all communist countries have a black market, which is pure capitalism. You could sell jeans in the old USSR for $100 a pair, because that was what they wanted, because you couldn't sell them in the open. It's in steep decline. It's shown to be a failed system. Even China has really acknowledged that. It's a form of totalitarianism as it was implemented in these countries. One-party rule. We see what's going on in Hong Kong right now. Okay? It's a utopian ideology at bottom. A well-intended utopian ideology at bottom, but it just has not worked in practice. Now, finally, what is democracy? Well, it's government by the people, by the demos. Direct democracy, where we vote directly, referenda, the New England small town, and representative democracy, which is more common, where we have delegates to congresses or parliaments. You must have political parties, must have a constitution with the rules and the regulations. It's an 18th century idea, part of the Enlightenment. We got tired of those aristocrats making decisions, horrible decisions. Look, if you can get rid of democracy, if you can get rid of aristocracy, you can do anything in human society, believe me. Because that structure was so entrenched for thousands of years. I mean, in the West, since Roman times, but way before then, with Pharaoh and so forth. If you can get rid of aristocracy and institute a whole different system called democracy, you can restructure human society in any way. We're the first new nation. We're the first ones to try this. We were the first new nation to try democracy, but capitalism, 1776. So we were really, really, really unique. But we're very imperfect. There is corruption. There's been very, very, very gradual reform, like the right for women to vote after about 100 and some years. We still have prisoners who cannot vote. We still have, I understand, 7,000 voting precincts have been closed in the last 2 years in the United States. 7,000 voting precincts. I wonder what that's about. Lots of corruption, lots of favoritism. Keep in mind that there's various forms. The U.S. is a republic with 50 states and a federal system, 3 branches. Not all democracies have 3 branches. UK is a monarchy, a constitutional monarchy with a parliamentary system. No president, but a prime minister. Notice they just changed prime ministers in England in the last, few months without a national election. Because the prime minister is chosen by the party, not the electorate. It's a different system. Election every 5 years in England, every 5 years in France, every 5 years in Germany. But you can have a snap election any time in those systems if there's ever a vote of no confidence. We will have an election every 40 years, no matter what. We'll have an election only every 40 years. 4 years, did I say 40? 4 years. Many have coalition governments. You must have 51% to govern, so you got to bring in other parties. What goes together? Democracy and capitalism go together. Milton Friedman was big on that, the economist from Chicago. But democracy and socialism can go together. I mentioned England, well, true of many Germany and other European places. Communism and socialism always. Monarchy and capitalism, yes. Monarchy and socialism, yes. Spain, Norway, these places. Norway has a monarch, but it's a mainly capitalist country, Norway, with a big welfare state. And totalitarianism and socialism, USSR, China, and capitalism, fascist regimes in Germany and Italy the companies really liked them. The Volkswagens of the world and the Fiats of the world were very close with those fascist dictatorships. Democracy and capitalism apparently won the Cold War in the battle after World War II. They've been spreading. But we've not attained utopia. There are still many, many problems. But the fears about socialism are greatly overblown. Finally, the climate crisis as an example. These 2 economic systems, which have been the dominant ones for the past 150 years, they're the most important contributors to the climate crisis. They're based on economic growth and use of fossil fuels. The market will not solve the climate crisis. It won't do it, because there'll be market failure. There has been market failure. We knew about this in the 60s, this climate, the greenhouse effect. We knew about it, people were teaching about this in the 60s. What will address it? It's got to be government-implemented regulations. But who controls the government? That's the really important question, because democracies are up for grabs. They're up for grabs. It's an relatively open system. No country or company will have a competitive advantage if the same rules apply. Keep that in mind. If we do have international regulations, or at least domestic regulations, no company has a competitive advantage by polluting. Right now, the disincentive to absorb your own greenhouse gases, because your competitor won't, and will have lower costs and get more business. So a level playing field. You can offer incentives as well. So, conclusion one. No candidate's going to turn the U.S. into a socialist or communist country. Bernie Sanders, who is a socialist, a social democrat, he talks himself as being a socialist, not a socialist. What big companies is Bernie going to take over and have the government run? None. What's Bernie? Bernie is a New Deal Democrat. He likes big government programs designed to protect, in his mind, the public interest. He likes government to do things. He likes government. He's not a socialist, because he doesn't want to own any of the means of production, none of the productive facilities. By the way, we sold GM and Chrysler within about 4 or 5 years of our buying them, and we sold them both at a loss. But now they're private companies again. But welfare state programs are required for the reasons I've mentioned. And Bernie wants to go to the New Deal era, and so do many candidates, which is decidedly not socialism. It's government involvement, it's government regulation, which for some people means communism. But it's not. It's a code word, and you're going to hear a lot about it. You're going to hear a lot about it in this campaign, including about taxes. Some folks want to go back to the 19th century where there's full laissez-faire and no government regulation at all, and that's the libertarian view. Just trust people. Just trust individuals. If we just take care of our own interests, the public interest is automatically taken care of. History has shown that's not true. The common good will not be taken care of if we all pursue radically our own individual interests. But you don't need necessarily government to do that. You can have groups like the League of Women Voters. All these, these civic organizations do this too. Because government, you got to be. Oops, did I take that back? You've got to watch government. You've got to watch government. Government can be corrupt too. Yeah. You must watch government. But responsible government is necessary. To do that, you need citizenship. And you need groups that are private and nonprofit, like the League and many others, civic organizations, the Rotary and all those organizations. Keep in mind, most corruption today is on Wall Street in the private sector, not the public sector. So, conclusion 2, become a citizen. Or be a citizen. Register. Follow the news. Educate yourself. Vote. Participate. Spread the word. And 2020 is one of our most important elections, I'm sure you agree. And I thank you for listening.